So welcome everyone. Welcome to ORFC Global, and I hope you've been enjoying the rest of the conference. I'm Abby Rose. I'm the co-host of Farmerama Radio. We are the official media partners for this conference, so hopefully you've seen some of our guides and even tuned into some of our briefings on Instagram Live every morning at 11:30 GMT. And this evening, well, I'm based in the UK, so this evening here, I'm helping to moderate this brilliant session with Massy and Bruce Pascoe. And we're focused on how Australian First Nations peoples' land and food management and regenerative agricultural practices are closely aligned. And so Charlie, Massey, and Bruce are going to be discussing this. And I'm personally really excited for this conversation. I have to say, firstly, that I've never actually been to Australasia, or that's part of the world. So in some ways, I feel very disconnected from this conversation. But on the other hand, I think that, you know, we really are across all nations, it seems, or many different parts of the world, we're sort of going through an awakening or a recalibration of understanding the value of Indigenous knowledge and how that relates to some of the regenerative agricultural practices. And sometimes there's tensions between the two, and sometimes they're seen to be aligned. And so I think it's really important to have this discussion and share these insights that Charlie and Bruce have kind of had a dialogue around already. So I'm really excited to hear this. So first up, Charlie's going to speak, and I'm going to introduce Charlie, and then Charlie will introduce Bruce. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A towards the end. So very pleased to introduce Charlie. We met a few years back when you were visiting the UK for the Groundswell conference, and did a brilliant presentation about the global context for regenerative agriculture, and also, you know, specifically through a lot of the research you've done for your book. So Charlie's farmed for over 35 years. You had a merino sheep stud, and I guess it was through kind of concerns of land degradation in your farming practices that you returned to university to study human ecology. And my understanding was that your book really was a compilation of a lot of the research that went on as you were transforming your own farming practices, on, you know, transforming the 2,000 hectare property back to a state of natural health. And your book is called The Call of the Reed Warbler, and it's really a brilliant collection of stories of how innovative farmers are finding a new way to transform the landscape through regenerative practices. So really pleased to be hearing from you, and I will leave the floor to you now to share the context for tonight's talk.
Thanks very much, Abby, and good morning or evening to everyone. Great to be here, and it's a real pleasure to work with Bruce Pascoe again. When I introduce him, I'll be touching on his wonderful work coming out of Dark Emu, and his ongoing work from there, which has been just opened up huge vistas for what our Aboriginal or First Nation people were doing in the form of agriculture and ecological management. So I'm going to do a 15-minute introduction with PowerPoint just to set the context for our discussion, and hopefully I'll be able to get that up. I might need some help. Here we go. Yep. So that's just the title slide. And when the white invaders first arrived to settle Australia, 1788, there's at least 250 different individual nations with their own languages and dialects, and effectively they were occupying distinct ecological regions with complex social, religious, spiritual beliefs and arrangements designed for sustainable regenerative land management. And we're talking about over 60,000 years of such management. It's an extraordinary story. And one of those forms of management is what's called traditional or cultural burning, which is still widely practiced. And we run courses with a senior Indigenous landman, you can see on the left, Rod Mason, to incorporate that in our management. And the reason it was used is that over 60% of Australia's natural vegetation is adapted to fire and smoke, over 20 chemicals in smoke, for propagation and regeneration. Now, in reality, our species co-evolved in landscapes in Africa, but also, you know, over 65,000 years of Indigenous people in Australia. And for example, that photo there in the 1930s, that woman on the right, like many Indigenous First Nation people, they can recognise well over 500 different food plants. And in those landscapes where they're hunting meat as well, those animals, it's not just meat, they've got tens of thousands of phytochemicals to choose from, and which we co-evolved to use for health and immune function in our diets. And that work's been highlighted by Professor Fred Provenza at Utah State, who's now retired, who I've worked with. And that just gives you an idea of what's in a grazing or shrub landscape that meat animals eat. You know, tens of thousands of different types of chemical families that are incorporated for different reasons. And this is a photo, again, from my friend Rod Mason, with his permission, of his great-grandfather. That man is aged 91, and you can see the health and vibrancy of someone who's largely lived a diet of our natural landscapes with their diverse chemicals here, the nutrients and phytochemicals, etc. But unfortunately, this over 60 millennia extraordinary management and adaptation to ice age and everything else came unstuck with the white invasion after 1788. And then a doctrine called terra nullius that denied any recognition of land ownership or rights by the Indigenous people. And I can give you an example. This is my friend Rod Mason, Ibai Wambara. The Monero people might have been 500. They were pretty well wiped out within 3 decades through poisoning, shooting, sent to concentration camps, etc. And that's rarely acknowledged still today. It was really an extermination and removal of country. And that was involved in the white settlement. And that was really driven through the 19th century by the rise of the modern capital industrialisation, where Australia really became, funded by British capital, a resource for huge volumes of wool, the biggest in the world, to feed the mills of Bradford and Huddersfield. And then later in the 19th century, industrial wheat production off landscapes. And the net consequence was not just widespread destruction of those landscapes, but the Indigenous First Nations people were gradually pushed out of all that rich country. And that just gives you a feel of how the landscape was changed with modern technology as part of this cultural and landscape colonisation as we got inducted into the global capitalist trading system. And if you look back at the broad scheme of how modern Western agriculture evolved, it began with domestication of plants and animals 10 or 11 millennia ago. And probably a first critical step was the development of the first plough. And that's a photo I took when on a mountaineering trip into the Himalayas, almost an exact replica of what's called the yard. That had huge consequences, really, when our species began to step outside its natural limits. And Karl Marx, in his work, presciently touched on the idea of a metabolic rift, that disjunction between the nutrients off our landscape disappearing into the sinkholes of the rising urban concentrations in Europe. And that you can see the flow. We haven't got time for the detail, but through those series of ecological transformations, that metabolic rift really came to the fore with modern industrialisation in the 19th century. And of course, the final step was the entrenchment of the 7 major platforms of industrial agriculture, right through the 20th century. And recently, post the Second World War, things like chemical pest weed control, manipulation of plant and animal genomes, and factory farming of animals. So the consequence of the white invasion of Australia was techniques that were taken from northwestern Europe, rich soils, post-glacial, chock full of nutrients, lush water cycle, came to an ancient continent that was totally different, up to 3.8 billion years old, some of it in Western Australia. And those tools and ideas had devastating consequences. For example, underneath this ancient landscape, healthy tree function and water cycling kept the water table down. But once the trees were cleared, the salt rose, and we now have millions of hectares of dry land salinity. We pretend we didn't have Dust Bowl like the United States, but at the very same time we did. And that was clearing of very marginal country called Mallee and Wimmera eucalypt trees to grow wheat for that burgeoning modern economy. And as Wes Jackson said, the ploughshare may well have destroyed more options for future generations than the sword. And you can see how much soil was lost, and that's happened on 5 or 6 occasions, and recently, the last 2 years, it's happened again. And this land degradation is still ongoing. We still treat the country as a resource. Widespread clearing still occurring over much of the eastern half of Australia at least, and the other issues you can see on the right. It's all ongoing, especially when droughts occur. And what we've really lost, actually, and most of us don't even recognise we've lost it because we've never seen it, is a healthy small water cycle. That's where you get a lot of transpiration and absorption during the night of important 1 or 2 mils of water every night. And the consequences of that, uniquely for Australia, was that the original healthy ecosystems had lots of these little critters, the hopping marsupials, and their favourite food are fungus or truffles, particularly mycorrhizal fungi. And with the clearing of land, the feral cats that escaped and foxes, these guys are pretty well gone over much of the crucial agricultural area, and so things like the small water cycle just don't work because all the fungi have disappeared. So just to float some ideas for this discussion on definition of what is regenerative agriculture. These are just some ideas that we can touch on later given the topic we've got. It's more than just sustaining something, I believe. Is it an active rebuilding or regeneration of existing landscapes and food and fibre systems towards full health? I think there's various ways we can interpret it. An open-ended process of ongoing improvement and positive transformation of natural and human complex adaptive systems. And it definitely should not exclude First Nations people. And I know there's a bit of controversy around that. So just quickly to set up the context, in the work I've done and in my teaching and writing, you can really distill the way our landscapes function, and this is the key regenerative agriculture, down to these 5 functions. Most people usually ignore the 5th, that weird species on the right there. But getting these working all in synergy, as those arrows show, is the secret to regenerative agriculture. And you destabilise any one of those, you chop those arrows and it doesn't work properly. And of course, the essence of it is that most of these key functions we take for granted because they're actually free. And the critical one obviously being solar energy, which drives the whole process. And my approach to landscape management is to try and stack on my land as many solar panels, the chloroplasts, for as long as I can throughout the year. It's a fairly simple role in regenerative agriculture to drive that carbon into the ground. And that's just one quick example of a farmer in the Karoo region of Africa who inherited or took up desert country as on the right, and by applying holistic grazing management, working with those 5 functions, within decades he transformed his land in startling fashion. And that these principles are now being applied to cropping as well. For example, multi-species cover crops, just driving that carbon in, keeping as much green. It's transformative. And of course, from a healthy carbon solar cycle comes a healthy water cycle. And that blue arrow is actually the same point in that landscape, a landscape that switched to regenerative holistic grazing, and you can see the transformation again. So it's sort of not rocket science. This is our own farm in this last drought, 3-year drought. Those 2 photos on the left show our farm. We're on the right, where we tried to keep our ground cover, and we had a neighbour on the left who just belted his country. So a month after those photos on the left, we had the drought-breaking rain of, in your terms, 4 inches or 100 millimetres. That water is running on his farm after only 15 to 20 millimetres, and that country kept shedding water and mud for the remainder of that rain, whereas our country on the right, even after the 4 inches, 100 mils, ran no water because the soil was able to absorb it. So as I say, it's not rocket science. And of course, that brings us to the third key function, the soil mineral cycle and the soil food web. And so many of us, we're ignorant of the fact that it's the life in the soil fed by carbon and other activity that is the secret. We have a wonderful soil scientist, Walter Yaner, a friend of mine, who has this wonderful metaphor that soil should be like cathedrals, and that they should contain in a healthy aggregated soil at least 50% of air, and those wonderful voids and spaces play roles in water storage, nutrient exchange, protection from diseases, etc. But if we carry on like those photos on the right, it's almost exactly the same as the bombing of those cathedrals as in the Second World War. So you'd have a dysfunctional soil immediately. And the fourth example is straightforward. If you get all those other functions going, you get wonderful biodiversity or dynamic ecosystem communities, pest control, all those sorts of things that come with huge diversity, mutualisms, symbiosis, etc. So I float the idea of possibly a different definition of regenerative agriculture. And I'm saying this in the context of the wonderful work in recent decades in complex adaptive systems. Could it be the management of landscapes that enables complex adaptive social ecological systems to self-organise themselves back to fully functioning health? And this is through the enabling and appearance of what are called emergent properties. Or, more simple way, is it landscape and ecological management with forever in mind? So that's pretty much where I'll leave that introductory session to set up the discussion. And just quickly, a moment ago, I was asked to introduce Bruce. Well, I've had the privilege of spending some sessions with him on literary festivals. And he really hit prominence with his most extraordinary book called Dark Emu. And that's now gone on to other books and other wonderful research, and including putting principles into practice. But basically, Bruce shocked, if you like, much of traditional Australia with his discoveries on how our Indigenous people for tens of millennia have been practicing forms of what we would call agriculture, growing food, processing food, etc. And I'll let Bruce describe all that. But what he's really done in a very constructive, not aggressive way, and in combination with other writers in this space like Bill Gamage, who opened up the whole fire management system, is to put on the table and start an exciting discussion, both nationally and internationally, on the importance of those tens of millennia of ecological knowledge and complex spiritual and ecological knowledge that went with it to sustain systems, but also I think it offers many important lessons for us to take into the future. So I'll pass over to Bruce.
Thanks, Charles. My name is Bruce Pascoe. I'm a Yuin Bunurong and Tasmanian man. And it was stunning to see those examples of erosion that Charles put up there, where 3 or 4 metres of soil disappeared because of inappropriate farming practice. I know examples of 13 metres of soil having disappeared from the Australian landscape, and this is in a country with the poorest soils in the world. We can't afford to lose any of that. To do so really disqualifies you from calling yourself a farmer. Colonialism destroyed Aboriginal Australia's economy and society. It didn't kill it, but it was incredibly destructive. And we can't have this discussion unless we talk about capitalism and Christianity, because both of those things were the drivers behind the invasion of Australia and most other continents in the world by Europeans, including the British. And if you are a Christian country and you invade another people's country, you have to explain to yourself why that is justified. And in the British case, that was explained by terra nullius. That is, this was a country with no people. So you enter that country and you tell yourself the lie that there were no people in existence there, when in fact Aboriginal people had an agricultural economy. It didn't look like England, but it was an economy and it was agricultural. And Aboriginal people were domesticating plants, harvesting plants, storing food from those plants, and we need to analyse the politics of that era in order to understand the destruction that was wrought. Because in denying that Aboriginal people had an agriculture, we're also denying 100,000 years of human knowledge and information, the ability of humans to trial something, to fail, adapt and succeed. And in Australia, that trialling of method involved fire. But as Charles pointed out, one of the crucial things that Aboriginal people did was make sure the ground was covered. As soon as you uncover the light soils of Australia and expose them to runoff from heavy rain, and in particular wind and the solarization of the sun, then you are beginning to destroy soil. And so that ignorance, that necessity of working ignorantly meant that so much damage was done. And at the farm at Yumbara, south of here, I'm currently at Bermagui, which is Yuin land, and but it's 3 hours north of my farm at Yumbara, down on the Wallagra River near Malakuta. And isn't it interesting that all of the words that I've used are Aboriginal place names, and yet right up until this point, Australian government does not have Aboriginal people in the Constitution. We've retained the place names, but eliminated the people or knowledge of their agricultural systems. I think in Australia and perhaps in the world, we're on the brink of making a massive change in our way of thinking about the world. I think to begin to question capitalism is not to promote communism, because remember that the communists drained the Aral Sea for the production of cotton. So disagreeing with capitalism is not because we're from the left, it's because we're from organisations that are concerned about Mother Earth, about her ability to sustain us. And our arrogance has meant that we have expected her to respond to every one of our scientific and industrial schemes. And she's incapable of doing that. And we haven't realised it up until this very moment. And it's really encouraging that a conference like this exists, but it's not just sufficient to acknowledge these things, we have to do them. If we continue to behave as if the gross national product of any country can rise exponentially, our use of resources and production of pollutants can go on exponentially as it is at the moment. If we allow, as has happened in New South Wales in Australia in this last 10 years, that 30% of the reef fish in New South Wales have disappeared in 10 years, indicating that in another 10 years we will have lost 60%, then that is criminal behaviour. It's Trumpian, in the worst use of that word, that we allow our ego to dominate the world to such an extent. And that word domination comes from our religion, because both the Bible and the Quran talk about man having dominion over the earth. And in Aboriginal Australia, we don't believe that. We believe that we are totally responsible to the earth, not the other way around. She is not responsible for us in any way. She will give, but only on her terms. We cannot demand. So we have to work within the limits of Mother Earth and enjoy those limits, not rebel against them, but enjoy the limits that the earth imposes on us, because this is how we survive as a global, I was going to say economy, but as a global population, that's how we survive. And in Australia, we altered the land here. Aboriginal people certainly altered the land. You saw Rod Mason before using fire. We altered Australia by the use of fire. But we kept carbon in the soil. We kept returning carbon to the soil, because the grasses that we used to produce the flour for our bread have enormous root masses. They're perennial grasses. You don't plough to promote them. You leave the ground unploughed, and those perennial grasses bind the soil and they sequester carbon. And all of those things are incredibly important for us today. Our root vegetables were also perennial. We could harvest the roots of those vegetables, press the plant back into the ground, and therefore we were sequestering carbon and improving the soil. And this is the thing that the first British farmers around the city of Melbourne noticed, was the soil was so light and fine that you could run your fingers through it. But it was incredibly fertile at the same time. And that was because Aboriginal people were utilising kangaroos and emus for meat protein, but those beasts don't compact the soil like sheep and cattle and goats and buffalo and all the other things that were imported into Australia and have successively destroyed our soils. They're also destroying our economy, and we're trying to alleviate that destruction with chemicals. So if you throw superphosphate on the ground, you will get a boost, but you will not get the same boost the next year or the next year or the next year. What is happening when you're doing that, when you're putting an artificial chemical onto your ground, is that you in fact are spending the capital of the world. You're spending other people's capital. And in this case, it's spending the accumulated capital that Aboriginal people have invested in the soil. And it might look like you're getting a terrific result, but in fact, there's perennial decline in the wealth and health of those soils. So at Yumbara, my farm down south, we're growing our perennial grasses, we're growing our perennial vegetables, we're growing our perennial fruits, and we're not growing monocultures. We allow various grasses to grow with each other as they want to do. And we were devastated by the fires of 2020. They went through my farm and we fought for 5 weeks. Managed to save the farmhouse, but our entire crop was burnt. And I was in despair. I thought we had lost the opportunity to allow Aboriginal people to be involved in their agriculture. But in fact, Mother Earth had the answer, because after about 30 mil of rain fell, so just over an inch of rain, and within days we had grasses regrowing. In fact, the fire had promoted Australian grasses and suppressed the exotic overseas grasses. So we had the best crop of grass that we'd ever had as a result of that fire and rain. And so it taught us that our soil will talk to us about what it wants to grow. Because this is Australia, we cannot treat it as if it's Kent. And so we now know that if we use fire judiciously, and I'm not recommending that we have anything like the fire we had this time last year, because I never want to return to those days again. They were truly horrible. And it wasn't Aboriginal burning that did it. It was the misuse of Australian forests that had caused that. Australian forests now are almost like industrial zones where the trees are being grown for wood chips, and each tree is 3 metres from the other tree, and that is a highly combustible forest. It's another story, but we don't want to return to that. But we do want to return to the kind of burning that Charles was talking about, that cool burning that Aboriginal people knew so well. And these are techniques. They're not romantic notions. These are techniques of care for farmland. And that's what I hope Australia will do. I hope the world will do it, because it's not just Australia that is being destroyed. Look what's happening in South America. Look what's happening in the Amazon. Look what's happening in America, in those regions that are constantly ploughed, and soil constantly blown up into the atmosphere and ending up in our oceans and our rivers, where they continue to destroy the health of our marine systems. These techniques are not fanciful. They're based on 100,000 years of human knowledge and experience, and they have to be respected for that. We have to get over colonialism. We have to get over our avoidance of the historical past. We have to get over what our capitalism and Christianity has done to the world, and learn about the earth itself. Christianity is not incompatible with healthy farming. But if we continue to say that man has dominion over the earth, then we are bound to destroy our home. And so that is why I'm so anxious to demonstrate on the farm that it's possible to farm this way and make a living and employ Aboriginal people and resolve the conflict between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And that message, I think, is applicable to the rest of the world. We have to live in more peace together. We have to farm peacefully, and we have to eat peacefully, because we eat far too much. We make too many demands on the earth, and we need to be more considerate, or we will lose our home. We might be having tourism on Mars or whatever, but that's not a way to go. That is such a short-term solution to the destruction of the earth. Why would you want to go to Mars and leave this place, this beautiful earth? Look at the beauty of this place behind me. That's Mount Gulaga, the very heart of the Yuin nation, of the Yuin spirit, where the whole of our philosophy was represented in women. Hardly any reference to men at all. It was all about women and children, and not one weapon, and no plough either. We tilled the soil, but we didn't plough. We didn't turn up the microorganisms to the sun. We allowed them to remain where they were. Anyway, I always get a bit inspired, and you can sense the urgency in my voice, I suppose. But we don't have a lot of time to correct our mistakes, and we have to find a way of making sure that our parliamentary representatives have intelligence and compassion. Never been greater need for intelligence and compassion, and less greed. I can't emphasise it enough that we need to promote good people, not wealthy people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thanks for sharing all of your wisdom. And also, Bruce, could you just tell us exactly where you are, what the beautiful lake and background is, so people know it's not just a background setting?
Well, it's the Pacific Ocean. The mountain behind me is Mount Gulaga, which is the heart of the Yuin spiritual life. And this is the town of Bermagui, and Bermagui means big canoe, because Aboriginal people were seafarers, and that is a lovely emphasis for us, because when the first European sailors came to Australia, they found Aboriginal people way out to sea fishing, but that's another thing that colonialism has refused to acknowledge. So, to retain a name like Bermagui is for us a kind of access to the past. Even though everything has been done to destroy Aboriginal culture and history, all the names are kept. It seems like the invader can't help but keep the names of the country intact. And almost all the names on this coast are Aboriginal names. And I'm hoping that this is a conduit for Australia to learn to love their country by reusing the Australian Aboriginal names with all the beauty that they talk about. And many of them, of the town names and district names, are agricultural terms. Darug, which is to the north of here, Darug means Murnong. This is a tuber, an Australian tuber. So the people call themselves a plant, and the people of the interior often refer to themselves as grass. We are the grass people. We are the people who harvest grass. These are important philosophic and agricultural terms that once we start to learn them and use them, we'll understand how to save our country, how to save the soil. Not about saving the nation, it's about saving the soil, and with that we'll save ourselves.
Actually, that was the question I had for you both. Last night, Rebecca Hosking gave a talk, and she's a British farmer, but she's traveled quite a bit making films and documentaries, and met quite a few different Indigenous people on different lands. And she was investigating the use of the term nature, and how within regenerative agriculture, often people will talk about regenerative agriculture as kind of mimicking nature or working with nature, and how in many Indigenous cultures, when she asked people what the word for nature was, there wasn't an equivalent word. People would talk about the mother or the home, or and I wonder, like, I would love to hear from both of you, you know, how much is the language we're using, you know, is that the main difference between regenerative agriculture and more Aboriginal or Indigenous practices? You know, are the languages very different in the Australian context?
Well, Charles, if you don't mind, I'll jump in there, because I think when we use words like Mother Earth, a percentage of the agricultural population sneers, you know, because it seems like an emotional term applied to an industrial practice, when in fact we should learn to respect the mother. She's the mother behind us. That's Mother Gulaga, and you know, to respect the earth, to love the earth, to revere her, is not an impractical notion. It is not romantic in any way. It is how humans have survived in a difficult climate in Australia. So I think the language is very important, and I've been trying to make, you know, the words Mother Nature or Mother Earth acceptable agricultural terms, so that we concentrate on the earth and respect her and her needs. And in such a brazenly craven capitalist system, it's very hard to get any traction with ideas that involve respect and love.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Charles, do you have any thoughts on that? And like, what if you started talking about love and Mother Earth? How would that be received?
Yes, it's challenging. I mean, it's interesting if you look at, I talk about the mechanical mind and the rise of science and industrialism, and the root word of ecology, oikos, means home, which I think is interesting. The field of regenerative agriculture is actually a broad church. It's aside from the indigenous tens of millennia practicing of it, for Western agriculture, it's really only a few decades old, and so people are just on the journey. And for some of them, when you, as I've done, you mention the word love, ethical and spiritual elements, and Mother Earth, it's very, very challenging. But the more people are involved in it, the more they're moving on that spectrum towards that Indigenous worldview of seeing a nourishing mother. And if we can commit matricide, well, the result's going to be inevitable. And I thought Bruce alluding to the reef fish, it's just the really big issue confronting us, which is why this broader field of regenerative agriculture is so important, is that we are now into the Anthropocene. The evidence is so overwhelming. We've only got a generation to turn that around. And one of the things that excites me about regenerative agriculture, and I've been working with people like Paul Hawken, etc., and his work following on from Drawdown. If you look at the 80 or 90 thoroughly researched best methods of addressing climate change by pulling carbon dioxide down into the earth, again. Out of the top 20 methods, half of them are regenerative agriculture. Put them together, we're number one at addressing that fundamental issue. So, and again, that all comes back to this concept of the earth as our mother and that sustainability. I'll just make one other point that Bruce touched on, talking about phosphorus. So the gap between the white invaders and that indigenous management, Australian soils are so ancient and leached that there's not many of the key elements like phosphorus, et cetera, et cetera. So what's happened is that our underground ecologies have evolved these extraordinary methods of cycling rapidly, very small amounts, and fire also is involved in that. And you come along and hit those complex ecologies with huge doses of superphosphate, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like a huge poison dose. So I think Bruce has just covered that beautifully, that I think that the ultimate shift in regenerative agriculture has to be a deep philosophical shift to a space that's very, very similar or the same as our First Nations, our Indigenous peoples' view, because if we don't sustain the mother, we're all gone.
Totally. And I just had one question for you, but before I just give everyone else's questions, and that was, you know, we've had quite a strong focus on the ecological side of it. And Bruce, you have obviously brought up some of the kind of systems of the world as like the capitalist economies and all these things are kind of keeping us in a certain way of working together. And I wondered, you know, ecology is almost one part of this whole story. And my experience of Indigenous cultures, and certainly what I've learned from the Aboriginal understanding of the world, is that it's very like all one and all interlinked, and you know, the human is part of the ecological system, and that human to human interactions and healing, you know, I guess you did allude to this a number of times, like it's all part of it. And I wonder, yeah, is, you know, Charles, in your definition of regenerative agriculture, is that part of it? Well, yeah, what do you both think on that point?
Go ahead, Bruce.
Oh, well, I think that we need to see ourselves as just another animal in the whole realm of the natural world, and respect our position as just another animal. And Aboriginal people did that through a totemic system where, for instance, I am oyster and wallaby and black duck, and that means that I have responsibility for those animals. I can't eat any of those animals, and it's, you know, it might seem like a prohibition and an impediment, but in fact it's just a way of ensuring that there is somebody in every community who is looking after those creatures and being part of them. We believe that, or the birds and the creatures and the worms are our relations, and that we are no more significant than the worm. In fact, the river that runs through my property is called the Wallagra, and it is the word for scrub worm, and it's a very ignominious looking creature, as most worms are, but central to the health of those river flats. Without the worm, there'd be no aeration, and we see that worm as important as the people who work on the farm. We see that the life of the plover, which you heard before, I think, is as important as any of us who work on the farm. It's just a different kind of mentality, and for humans to forget that they are just an animal is very dangerous hubris. And our belief that we can do anything to the world and there will be no consequence is very dangerous. For Elon Musk to be flying people in private aircraft to other planets isn't just an exciting scientific experiment. It's a dangerous act. We need to be far more humble. It doesn't mean to say we're less intelligent, we're less ambitious, but we're more humble. And the humility has gone out of the world, and humility has gone out of politics. In Aboriginal life, people are elected because of their humility. They become leaders because of their knowledge and their humility, not because of their wealth and their arrogance. And the world is out of kilter at the moment in that regard, and we need to return to it. And one of the ways to return to it is to love the seagull as thyself.
Charlie, do you have any? Well, thank you, Bruce. And yeah, I agree. Definitely every day is like new lessons in humility all the time. Feels like an incredibly positive approach to moving forward in the world. And Charlie, do you have any thoughts on that, especially, yeah, from a regenerative perspective, in terms of regenerative definitions?
Okay, the big challenge is this worldview shift. I mean, I deliberately used that metaphor of the Ard, the first plough. That was the fatal step. If you follow that, it led to the rise of those Middle East civilizations and then on to the Western civilizations. And as Caroline Merchant in The Death of Nature so beautifully analysed, the shift to the mechanical mind following the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, capitalist revolution, we get to the stage today that we are at the other end of the spectrum of this unified vision of that we are part of the earth, and if we're separate from it, we'll die. And so the metaphor of Musk and others making journeys into other planets sums up the whole process, that we don't see ourselves as part of the earth and we have this mechanical escapism. It's fatal. And how we shift, how we get this urgency, that these guys, the heroes of modern society, are these multi-billionaires, $80 billion, Musk and all those sort of guys. Whereas the heroes, to me, are the Bruce Pascoes and others of this world that are really doing things to reconnect us with Mother Earth. And how we make that shift when we've only got one generation to do it is the greatest challenge that our species has ever faced. I mean, you look at a Second World War or something, it's a storm in a teacup compared to what's coming unless we turn things around. That is the urgency. And regenerative agriculture, eating healthy food, incorporating all the knowledge of First Nations, Indigenous people are all part of the solution. But how you change those mindsets, those worldviews, that's the biggie.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm very conscious we're getting close to time, and I haven't given anyone questions to you guys yet. So I'm going to ask the top voted question so far, which is for both of you. Can you speak about how you believe food or crops should be traded or distributed once they leave the farm? You know, is there some wisdom we can take from Indigenous knowledge when it comes to like beyond the farm gate and that crops enter the wider non-agricultural community? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I think very important for us to think in terms of food miles, so that the freshness is still in our food when we eat it. I think that in the future, should we examine the kind of foods and preservatives that we're eating at the moment, we'll find that a lot of our woes are encapsulated in those chemicals that are added or withdrawn from our foods, and that we need to revere the integrity of the foods as they are. That'll mean an enormous change but it will also mean an enormous reduction in plastic. The two things will go together because preservation at the moment seems to rely on refrigeration and plastic and the addition of chemicals. So if we change those things, if we concentrate on eating seasonally and locally, we will go a long way to curing the perils of the pollution of our soils and our seas. And I look forward to those days where people can grow food in their gardens and sell a portion of it to their neighbours, as we used to do. It used to be common to do such things. And I remember at Malakuta, there you go, another Aboriginal word meaning sacred white pipe clay. At Malakuta, when I first went there,
Well, we're losing you a bit, Bruce.
we used from that dairy farm.
Oh, there we go.
That was also the basis of their economy.
We lost a little bit at the end there, but I think hopefully most people got what you were saying. And I wanted to follow that up with another question specifically around someone asked, how do we move beyond acknowledging Aboriginal excellence to doing something about it? They said that some young Indigenous people have been disconnected from country and disconnected from elders. How can we ensure the legacy of Indigenous excellence in land management survives? And I would add to that, like, how can we connect it with the regenerative experience? Like, and all these people who are identifying as regenerative farmers, what are the steps to bridge that potentially?
I think we have to acknowledge the realities of our political and commercial and religious world. And within each of those, the answer is held. It is not beyond the possibilities that Christianity can become part of the answer rather than the cause of the problem. It's not beyond the realm of possibility that commercialization of food can also be part of the answer. And it's not beyond the realm of the human mind to ensure that politics is a protection of the earth and the people rather than a cause of its demise. We the people, have the opportunity to make sure that those things happen. But we the people have abdicated our responsibility in many cases to a collective of ambitious men. And I think that's where we have to change our mind. We have to insist on better behaviour from our public figures. We have to insist on better behaviour from our religious leaders. We have to insist on better behaviour from our commercial operators. There has to be a morality in the commercial world. We should go into our best schools and say to those young 13 and 14-year-old people who are about to become the emperors of the commercial world, the people who are running our railways, the people running our stores, the people running our industrial complexes. We have to insist that those people learn about morality, that those people learn about the fragile nature of the globe and the dangerous application of ego. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be repeating the kind of horrors that people like Rupert Murdoch are perpetrating on the world. And our children should leave school with a zeal to protect the world, not a zeal to get themselves a BMW and the best house in the street. That kind of zeal is destroying the world. So we need our young people to leave school with notions of egalitarianism. As I said before, it's not going to be easy, but we need to insist that all public figures act with love for the world. I know it sounds corny, and you've probably heard those black cockatoos fly above me before. They were having a commentary on the errors of mankind, but I don't have no hope. I feel that humans have within us the ability to do good things, and I think we can recover, but we need to change our mind. It's our mind that needs to change. We need to be more humble. We need to be more intelligent. And intelligence is something which seems to have disappeared from public life.
And Charlie, do you have any thoughts to add to that question? And then we'll go to closing thoughts, if that's okay.
Addressing the issue for us is two very simple symbolic things that need recognition in the Constitution and seats in Parliament and recognition of a wonderful Indigenous statement from the heart that was delivered and then ruthlessly dismissed by our government. So that would be a good start. I personally think for a nation that was settled by a Christian belief system that it is a religion of love, and if it became focused on Mother Earth and got rid of all the impedimenta of hierarchy and everything that's wrong with it, it rather than trying to get super radical, it provides a place for those already existing, and I think there's many Indigenous communities that already embrace it. But if it was focused where it should be on love, that is a belief system that wouldn't have to be reinvented, but just properly adapted and placed. So we're getting the touchy ground, I know, but that's sort of the practicalities, I think.
We have to enter that touchy ground, though, don't we, Charles? We can't avoid it just because it's chancy. We have to go there because it is chancy, but it's our only chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Good words. It's chancy, but it's our only chance. And I think that is exactly, and, you know, thank you both a lot for speaking this evening and sharing where you're both at. And, you know, that is part of why I am excited about this dialogue, and I really hope we can continue it in many different ways, because I think it's a huge discussion. You know, it really is, rather than pitting regenerative against Indigenous, I think we need to find ways to recognize the values of, you know, so many years of history, and to definitely give all the credit to the Indigenous people for all that they are bringing and have brought. And we need to work together and find ways to work together, whether that's, you know, sharing our spirituality, sharing our belief, sharing our love, sharing beauty, whatever the words we use are. The more we're in dialogue, the more we can understand the beauty of the ocean and the hill behind. And, you know, it is all, I think somewhere it can speak to all of us. And I'm really, thank you both for sharing kind of from the soul, might you say. I really appreciate that, and I hope to continue the conversation with you both. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Annie. And Bruce, good to see you again, mate.
Good on you. I'm just showing you.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you, because we're in the dark and cold over in the UK, so that gives me a lot of hope.
That's what we've got to say.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great day all, or good night.